Thank you to the other Mr. Helseth. I wasn't quite as good of an introduction as Johnny Carson used to get, but then again, he had a lot more of an audience than I do, so I guess that's all right. Out of the 10 commandments, there's only one that explicitly admonishes us to remember it. And ironically, it's the very one that nearly everyone forgets. Of course, I'm referring to the fourth commandment, which says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work. From this, we can see that the fourth commandment doesn't just relate to a single day, but to the entire week. 6 days of work followed by a seventh day of rest automatically results in a 7-day weekly cycle. Even though our society does not observe the Sabbath, it still retains the 7-day week. People even distinguish between the work week, when they normally work, and the weekend, when they stop working. This idea of working most of the week and stopping at the end of the week is based on the same principle that defines the Sabbath. And so one could say that our society has a repressed memory of the Sabbath, because although the Sabbath is not observed, there are still elements of the idea in our 7-day week. The title of this sermonette is Remember the Sabbath-Week. Remember the Sabbath-Week, because the Sabbath is the seventh day, and we cannot separate the Sabbath from the concept of the week. Even though our society has the 7-day week, it has forgotten or ignored the Sabbath. Most people today believe that the first generation of Christians, the ones who wrote the New Testament, moved away from the Sabbath in favor of observing the first day of the week, which they called the Lord's Day, in remembrance of the resurrection. And they will say that the Apostle Paul especially did not want his Gentile congregations to keep the Sabbath. But we obviously believe that all Christians were originally keeping the Sabbath. So is there any clear evidence that Christians, and especially Gentile Christians, were originally keeping the Sabbath? Well, there is one passage in Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians that relates to this question. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 2, Paul refers to activities to be conducted on the first day of the week. Now, this verse is usually claimed to show that Gentiles under Paul's direction were not keeping the Sabbath, but were instead observing the first day of the week as the Lord's Day. But when we examine it closely, it actually shows the exact opposite. This is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 13, or verses starting in verse 1. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. Then verse 2, on the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. And when I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem. Paul here is instructing the Corinthians, just as he says he did with the Galatians, to set aside money to be sent to Jerusalem when he arrived. Since Paul tells them to set aside this money on the first day of the week, many will claim that the Corinthians must have been having a communal gathering on the first day of the week, where they took up a collection, similar to how many churches today pass the plate around at their meetings. And since Paul doesn't mention the Sabbath, they assume that the observance of the first day of the week, or the Lord's Day, had replaced the Sabbath for these Gentile Christians. But if we examine this passage more closely, we can find several problems with this common interpretation. For one thing, Paul's instructions in 1 Corinthians 16 to set aside money are not to the group collectively, but rather to each individual. He says, on the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. So Paul is not telling them to have a group collection, but rather that each individual should set aside money on his own at the beginning of the week so that people wouldn't wait until he arrived and then try to gather up as much as possible at the last minute. Since they were individually setting aside money, there is no reason from this verse to assume that they were meeting as a group on this day. But the most significant fact about this passage is hidden beneath the surface in the Greek phrase, which is translated as the first day of the week. The phrase that is translated first day of the week in 1 Corinthians 16, chapter 16, verse 2, the phrase that is translated first day of the week here consists of two words, mia Sabbaton, mia Sabbaton, mia M-I-A, Sabbaton, S-A-B-B-A-T-O-N. This phrase, mia Sabbaton, used by Paul to refer to the first day of the week, was a unique Jewish way of numbering the days of the week in reference to the Sabbath. The word mia means one, as in the number one. And the word Sabbaton is the Greek representation of the Hebrew word for Sabbath. And it's in a grammatical form which is normally translated by the word of. Thus, the phrase that Paul uses here, mia Sabbaton, literally means one of Sabbath. In fact, every time the phrase, the first day of the week, occurs in the New Testament, including in each of the four Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, it is always a translation of some form of this phrase, mia Sabbaton. So how did this phrase that literally means one of Sabbath come to mean the first day of the week? The most common explanation is that by the time of the New Testament, the Jews had come to use the word Sabbath to also refer to the whole week. This would have set the Jewish week based on the Sabbath apart from other 7-day weeks that were in use at the time. The word mia, meaning one, referred to day one, and thus the phrase mia Sabbaton referred to day one of the Sabbath week, and would be followed by day 2 of the Sabbath week and day 3 of the Sabbath week, and so on. An example of the word Sabbath meaning week can be found in Luke chapter 18, verse 12, where in a parable, Jesus describes a self-righteous Pharisee who boasts about his righteous deeds, one of which is fasting twice in the week. In the original Greek, it literally says that he fasts twice of the Sabbath. In fact, every time the word week occurs in the New Testament, it is always a translation of the word meaning Sabbath. There is a word in Greek that means week, the word hebdomos, derived from the Greek word for 7, but this word is never used in the New Testament. This shows that in the first century, Jews were using the word Sabbath to refer to the week as well as to the Sabbath day, and they were numbering the days of the week relative to the Sabbath, with the first day of the week being called mia Sabbaton, or day one of the Sabbath week. The fact that Paul uses the phrase mia Sabbaton to refer to the first day of the week when speaking to Gentile Christians is significant for two reasons. First, it shows that the original generation of Christians were not referring to the first day of the week as the Lord's Day. If Christians were normally using the phrase the Lord's Day, it is inexplicable why the first day of the week, though mentioned in all four Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, and Paul's epistle to the Corinthians, is never called the Lord's Day, but is instead in every case referred to by a form of this Jewish phrase, mia Sabbaton. There is one place in the New Testament where the phrase the Lord's Day occurs, and that is in Revelation chapter 1, verse 10, where John states that he was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. But there is nothing in the context that indicates John was referring to a day of the week, as opposed to, for example, the prophetic day of the Lord. We do know that the Lord's Day was being used later in the 2nd century to refer to the first day of the week, but there is no evidence from the New Testament writings of this usage. Second, Paul's use of this phrase, mia Sabbaton, is significant because although there is a Greek phrase that would literally mean the first day of the week, Paul doesn't use it. Since mia Sabbaton was specifically a Jewish way of referencing the days of the week, the ordinary Gentile who had no knowledge of Jewish culture or customs would not even be able to understand what it meant. For one thing, the word Sabbaton is not a native Greek word, but a Greek representation of the Hebrew word for Sabbath. But even if a Gentile knew what the Sabbath was, this would not allow him to understand that the phrase mia Sabbaton, literally meaning one of Sabbath, referred to the first day of the week. The fact that Paul expected the Corinthians to understand that mia Sabbaton meant the first day of the week indicates that he must have previously explained to them this Jewish method of numbering the days of the week relative to the Sabbath, and that he expected them to use this system. If the Gentiles were not observing the Sabbath, there would have been no reason to use this phrase mia Sabbaton when Paul could have just said literally the first day of the week. In fact, if Paul did not want the Gentiles observing the Sabbath, as many believe, he almost certainly would have avoided using a system where every day was identified relative to the Sabbath. In summary, Paul's use of this phrase mia Sabbaton in 1 Corinthians 16 to refer to the first day of the week shows that Paul and his Gentile congregations were numbering the days of the week in reference to the Sabbath. And this provides strong evidence of the fact that the first generation of Gentile Christians under Paul's direction were observing the Sabbath. And if this were the case, it would certainly be true for Jewish Christians as well. All of this goes back to the fact that you cannot separate the Sabbath from the week. The early Christians, following the Jews, named the days of the week using a number plus the word for Sabbath, which made it virtually impossible for them to forget about the Sabbath. Unfortunately, our society has forgotten about the Sabbath, and in doing so, has failed to understand the central idea of God's plan. Hebrews chapter 4 explains how the rest of the Sabbath is symbolic of the rest that will result from entering into the kingdom of God. Hebrews 4 verse 9 says, "There remains therefore a rest for the people of God." The word translated rest here is sabbatismos, which literally means a keeping of the Sabbath. There remains therefore a keeping of the Sabbath for the people of God. And so the people of God still observe the Sabbath today as a symbol of the future entry into that rest. And unlike the world, which has forgotten the Sabbath, we have hope that we will have rest from the worldly troubles and labors that we now experience. So as we go through each week, let us look forward to that eternal Sabbath and diligently labor to enter into that rest.